Hello my friends. The Persian Empire believed in justice. They had strict and precise rules about judging the punishment for a crime. They believed that no one should be executed for a first crime, and the good deeds of each criminal should be considered before sentencing. If someone is going to suffer, they should deserve it. But if you deserve it, the Persians made sure to pay for it. They came up with some of the most creative and brutal punishments in history. Justice in ancient Persia was not always quick, but rather a slow, long and painful torture straight out of your worst nightmares. 10. Make a chair out of your own leather. When a Persian judge named Sisamnes was caught accepting a bribe, King Darius was determined to make an example of him. Darius believed that the courts in Persia should be impartial and fair. He was going to make sure that Sisamnes' replacement didn't make the same mistake. Sisamnes was killed, but that was only the beginning. After his throat was cut, Darius ordered the executioners to skin every inch of his skin into strips of human skin. Then he asked them to sew a chair made of Sisamnes' leather. From then on, the new judge must sit on a chair made of human flesh. And it gets worse, Sisamnes' replacement was his son. While he presided over the trials of Persia, he had to spend every day sitting on a chair made of his father's flesh. And now, as King Darius believed, they would have a judge who would never forget what happened if he accepted a bribe. 9. Drowning in a pool of ash. One of the worst deaths you could suffer in ancient Persia was suffocation on ash. It was a punishment reserved for the worst criminals, those guilty of high treason or crimes against the gods. And it was terrifying. The Persians preserved a hollow tower 23 meters, 75 feet, high that was filled only with ashes and wheels. At the top there was a sliding platform, up to which the criminal would be taken and thrown. He descends to the center of the tower. The fall would probably break some bones, but the ash would keep him alive long enough to suffer the slower, more brutal death they had planned. The executioners were turning the wheels. The men outside were moving it around, swirling the ashes around to force them into the convict's nose and mouth. He would inhale it and choke on the burning ash until he died. It's a phrase that few people have encountered, and it even appears in the Bible. In which a corrupt Jewish priest is killed by the Persians in the Tower of Ashes. When he dies, his family is not allowed to bury his remains. And the Bible says at the end of the story, and this is exactly what he deserves. 8. Pour molten gold down your throat. When the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured by Persian soldiers, he met a horrific end. He died a death that might look like something pulled from Game of Thrones. But the real story is much worse. Persian Emperor Shapur I kept Valerian as his personal slave. He was parading him in front of his army, handcuffing his hands and feet, and treating him like a dog. He humiliated him in every possible way. Before mounting his horse, Shapur would have Valerian get down on his hands and knees so that he could use him as a human seat. When Shapur got tired of his game, he killed him. He poured molten gold down Valerian's throat. Then he mummified the Emperor of Rome. Valerian was skinned and stuffed with straw, and his corpse was displayed in a Persian temple, a gold chalice and human remains. 7. Tearing people apart with trees. In the last years of Persia's rule, thieves had to deal with horrific punishments. Anyone caught robbing or harassing a passenger on the empire's roads was sentenced to death by being torn in half. The executioners would pull the tops of 2 trees as close together as possible and tie them together. They would drag the convict and tie one of his legs to the top of each tree. They then cut the rope holding the trees together. The 2 trees would spring free, separate from each other at incredible speeds and shoot back upright with the criminal still tied to them. His body would be torn in half from the force. Within a second, 2 halves of what was one man would be hanging from the trees. His body would be left there hanging on the road where he robbed an innocent person. The Persians believed that anyone who passed through these parts would receive a harsh reminder of what would happen if they followed the life of thieves. 6. Crush the heads of your servants with stones. As much as Persia tried to be fair about its crimes, it did not completely ignore the class situation. The king could get away with anything, and as long as those things were in his good books, so could his family. When King Artaxerxes II's mother killed his wife, he was unable to execute her, so he killed her servants instead. Parysates, Artaxerxes' mother, hated her daughter-in-law Statira, and Statira hated her right-hand man. They had to pretend to be civilized in public, but they tried to kill each other so often that Artaxerxes had to establish rules to prevent them from doing so. When they dined together, he ordered that everything they ate be cut into 2 parts and shared so that they could not poison each other. It did not work. Persides put poison on one side of the knife and told her servant to use it to cut the meat, poisoning the half that went to Statira and leaving the half untainted. It worked, and the king's mother killed the queen. It was clear, of course, who was responsible, but Artaxerxes could not bring himself to kill his mother. He tortured all of her servants until they confessed. The meat cutter's head was then smashed with a rock. However, Parysatis had just been sent into exile. It did not take long before Artaxerxes invited her back. She helped him choose a new wife. Parysates convinced Artaxerxes to marry his daughter. 5. Chains of people cut to the gates. It was fairly common in Persia and surrounding countries to torture rebels by cutting off their noses and ears. However, this kind of brutal torture was not always a death sentence. Sometimes, they kept you alive. Sometimes it was worse than death. When the people revolted against King Darius, he made sure everyone knew what would happen if they turned on him again. He gathered the rebel leaders, cut off their noses, ears, and tongues, and gouged out one of their eyes, but he did not kill them. Not yet. The rebel leaders were chained and tied to the front gate of his castle so that everyone who passed by could see their mutilated corpses. Meanwhile, their lieutenants were beheaded, and their heads were hung from the top of the city's castle. They were left there for weeks, taunted and beaten by everyone who passed by, as they stared at the remains of their friends and suffered in excruciating pain. Then, when they couldn't take it anymore, they were allowed to die. 4. Make the slaughter of your people an annual holiday. In Persia, Zoroastrian priests were called magi. This does not necessarily mean that they have magical powers, they were religious leaders. After one of them became overly ambitious, their jobs became hell. A magi named Smerdis tricked the people into believing he was the son of Cyrus the Great and crowned himself king of Persia. He was indeed a great king, beloved by his people. He introduced tax reforms that made life easier and relaxed military conscription laws, but he stole the throne, so it was natural for him to die. When people found out, they didn't stop at killing Smerdis. They ran through the streets of the kingdom, spreading the word and killing every member of the Magi they could find. When the massacre was over, the people decided to make it an annual event. Once a year, the Persians celebrated a festival called the Slaughter of the Magi. On the anniversary of Smerdis' death, they would run through the streets, and if they caught any Magi outside, they would brutally kill them. 3. Allowing insects to eat you alive. Scaphia may be the most famous Persian punishment, but the list wouldn't be complete without it. Little torture in comparison. This torture was reserved for people the king really hated. The victim is stripped of his clothes and placed inside a hollow tree trunk or in 2 boats, with his head, hands, and feet exposed to the sun. Then he was force-fed with milk and honey until he suffered from diarrhea and was buried in his own filth. The executioners would rub honey on the exposed parts of his body to lure insects. Insects crawled over the convict and slowly ate his flesh, while wasps tortured him with their stingers until he prayed for death. However, the executioners continued to force-feed him to keep him alive as long as possible. After a few days, the victim's mind begins to deteriorate, but he will still survive. It may take weeks before his body finally gives up and he dies. The first time they tried this, it took 17 days of torment and prayer for death before the victim's prayer was finally answered. 2. Triple death. Persians believe that some people deserve more than one death. If their crime was terrible enough, they wouldn't accept killing them all at once. They will make them die 3 times before they are allowed to stop breathing. The victims will not actually die, but will go through the agony of death 3 times. For example, when a eunuch angered the wife of Cyrus the Great, she first ripped his eyes out of his head. After he recovered, she skinned him alive. They then nursed him back to health before finally crucifying him. This was not the only time this happened. After a soldier tried to take credit for killing Cyrus the Younger in battle when he had only wounded him, the king ordered his execution. But the king's mother intervened, saying, "Leave him to me, and he will receive the appropriate reward for his bold words." First, she had him stretched out on the wheel for 10 days. Then I gouged out his eyes. And then, finally, she finished him off, pouring molten copper into his ears until he died. 1. Forcing people to eat their children. A mediocre general named Harpagus has undergone the worst possible punishment for the lightest crime. King Astyages had a dream that his grandson was going to overthrow him, so he ordered Harpagus to take the infant into the wilderness and leave him to die. Instead, Harpagus gave the child to a shepherd who raised the child as his own. It took 10 years for Astyages to discover that he had been disobeyed, but when he did, he was evil. He cut Harpagus' son's throat, cut him end to end, roasted his meat, and served it to Harpagus at a banquet. At first, Harpagus did not know what he was eating or even that his son was dead. But Astyages had his servants place the dead boy's head on the table in front of him and mock him, saying, "Do you know what beast meat you have eaten?" Harpagus knew what would happen to him if he tried to take revenge. He could not even dare to cry in front of the king who had killed and fed his son. Harpagus was forced to say, "I know, and everything the king does pleases me." He complimented Astyages on the dish and asked to take the rest with him. Then he took what they allowed him to take with him to his home and buried the last remains of his son. If you are a fan of horror and scary legends, do not forget to subscribe to the True Horror channel. Because we care about this content, activate the bell to receive new videos. See you.